much, Jakob, for the kind invitation. And definitely, I take this as an opportunity to bring my own contribution to the ontological reflections that are connected with both learning, education, and university life, starting from the perspective of rhythm and rhythm thinking, which is my field of expertise. So very briefly, if we look at my overview, what I will try to do today, and bear in mind, is in no way in the shape or form of a fully fledged theorization, but it is rather the beginning of the mobilization of some ideas that will luckily land in the field of theorization at some point. So I'll start from speaking about the ontology of rhythm, so shifting my understanding of rhythm from rhythm as an object of inquiry to rhythm as the subject of inquiry, to then see how this reflection on rhythm as ontology and ontology of rhythm can be transferred to, in some forms, understanding university ontology in rhythmic form. Then there will be an interlude on how to live and learn together, and I will tell a bit more on that later, but it is, I think, a necessary interlude in the times that we live in. And I will end with some tentative or beginning of illustration of the possibilities of form for higher education and the university. So this takes the stage of initial experimentation, if you like. So the departure, as I said, is a reflection on the ontology of rhythm and university ontology as a rhythmic form. So what we know usually, rhythm field and rhythm analysis and rhythmologies are complex fields, nonetheless, because there isn't a consensus or an agreement on what fundamentally rhythm is. In many ways, the kind of ontologization of rhythm is a shaky terrain. But as I said in the introduction, what I'm going to do today is to shift the focus on precisely attempting to bring ontology in rhythm, to then talk about connections with education, higher education, and universities. So the notion of rhythm that we are most familiar with and that we recognize as being the kind of strong and weak beat, the kind of emphasis on the coordinating temporality that is embedded in the meaning as an embodied movement organized in time, essentially, that has a very strong mathematical foundation on the notion of meter and numerical specificity, is what we find usually in the Platonic understanding and then the Aristotelian understanding of rhythm. And that's a common understanding that we have, that recurs in musical rhythm, in dance, and also in the use and applications of rhythm that we have seen in the few attempts at theorizing education through rhythms. But if we look at the etymology of rhythm and the use of Rhuthmós in pre-Socratic in pre-Socratic times, so in the poetic and philosophical works of the atomists, for instance, we find a connection between flow and form that can be derived from the root of the term, rein, to flow, and thmos, which is a suffix of regularity that tells us that there is a tension already present in rhythm that is about something that flows, something that changes, but also something that's got to do with the concept of schemata. But schema, and in this I bring in the work of linguist Émile Benveniste in the Problems of General Linguistics, is not understood as a fixed or a realized form, but Rhuthmós refers to the form in the moment in which it is assumed. So it's a mobile form, it's improvised, it's momentary, it's a modifiable form. So, sorry. We move in this understanding from the notion and the concept of order in movement, from the arrangement of bodily attitudes combined in meter, to a notion, which is Rhuthmós, that is much less tied to notion of time and temporality, and more to the kind of morphological and spatial, but also ontological understanding of a contingent configuration without necessity. And Barletta here, who wrote a wonderful book in this respect called Form and Dispossession, that offers this new theorization of rhythm that I very much rely on, tells us there is no body in movement or a drumbeat here. Rather, it seems to speak to a condition of being, a gravitational force that holds us all suspended. So we see in this very strong echoes of the atomist philosophical tradition, in which Rhuthmós is employed to signify that kind of emergent transitory form taken by matter during atomic assemblage, or in an expression that I very much like, a temporary stoppage in flow, an always provisional achievement within a world characterized by constant movement and interaction. So, and it's important, and I want to stress this and stay a little bit on this in Barletta's nuanced interpretation. Rhythm is almost a centripetal force that is somehow always already there, like a gravitational field that holds us in check and shapes us, giving us form and meaning, whilst also appealing to an acceptance of the limits of human power. And that's why he speaks of form and dispossession. So in a nutshell, by referring to Rhuthmós, so this ancient philosophical and philological understanding of rhythm, we effectively subsume the kind of temporal and aesthetic dimension of rhythm that we find, for instance, in Lefebvre's rhythm analysis. And we go deeper, we reveal a deeper layer that points to that kind of rhythmic ontologization, which is the starting point of this presentation. So rhythm here is not experienced so much in terms of acceleration, slowing down, that we are familiar with, but it constitutes the very condition for the possibility of experience. And so if and when we tend to speak of it in terms of what we perceive as the very common refrain of the patterns of repetition over time, what we're referring to with this perception of rhythm is the exposed summit of an enormous undersea mountain. So what I'm looking at today is that enormous undersea mountain, in the belief that this lends a much richer and deeper philosophical array of meanings to the understanding and the mobilization of rhythm when we talk about education and universities. So the questions that drive these presentations are this: is there a correspondence between Rhuthmós as this contingent, mutable form that is transformed through time, that holds us together, being always already there, and displaces us, and higher education as we know it? And if such affinity exists, what are the ethical and pedagogical possibility of an education and/or a university reconceptualized as a moving form of existential enrhythmment? So now, as I said, there will be an interlude here in expanding, if you like, the kind of visual field of what I'm trying to do by connecting, by pausing for a second and reflecting on what it means to live and to learn together in university terms, in educational terms, and within the context of the continuity of life. And here I literally bring some statements and ideas, or literally phrases in publications that seems to be haunting me no matter how my thinking progresses. One was basically Ron Barnett's coda to a publication on the question of time in university, that spoke of the ineradicability of rhythm in university time. And that sense of the ineradicability of rhythm in university time, I discovered, and I keep on, returning on, has a much deeper layer than the exposed summit of a realization of the accelerated pace of university life, the acceleration, the slowing down, the stillness, the pauses, the time in university. What Barnett means by ineradicability of rhythm, I think means and indicates the ineradicability of life, of being, of dwelling, and of the becoming with that happens within the institution of the university, and that defines very much the everyday life of the university. And yet, when we talk about this sense of education expanded to not to be, in a sense, considered the kind of preparation for life, but to be considered life itself, so the continuity of the life process as an essentially social undertaking and social reality, and in this sense, education being the means of this social continuity of life. I cannot not revisit also the statement that says that whenever and wherever life is going on, so too is education. And why I pause on this is because we live in a particular historical time where the possibility of life and the continuation of life is by no means a given. And so when we consider the fact that the continuation of life and the fact that life might not go on in certain parts of the planet, as we are witnessing every day, so does education stop in those parts of the world as well where life isn't going on? So where does that leave us in the institution of the university? And this question is very much connected to the third one of the kind of haunting statements that recurs in my thinking, which is taken from Derrida's The Eyes of the University. There is a question that he asks in a chapter, which is, what are the views from the university? With a view to what? So I leave this interlude here as a suspended, but also a lingering thought for us to discuss later on, when the continuity of life and educations are not a given. Where is the place of the university? Where and what are the views from the university, and with a view to what? Is this going to be the view of the business as usual? Is this going to be the view of the activist university? Is this going to be the view of academic citizenship? Something to discuss before I return to the question of ontology of rhythm and university and education, higher education as rhythmic forms. So, as I was saying before, in addressing those questions about the affinity of Rhuthmós as this kind of fugitive form and higher education as we know it, it is worth reiterating the fact that Rhuthmós has the inevitable tension of referring both to the kind of lived experience, but also the kind of abstract form that the subject of investigation, the theorization of rhythm that I was referring to, as our thinking of rhythm inevitably always happens at the edge of the experience of rhythm. Once we have experienced it, we then think about it and turn it into an abstract representation. But what I find particularly interesting and connected with the questions of life, continuity of life, and perpetuations and perpetuation of life through that kind of rhythm is found in Dewey Art as Experience, where he refers to these kind of rhythmic forms in tension with their environments as the means by which we produce transformation and growth. So for Dewey, the very dynamic relation between organisms and their environments is itself rhythm, and this is the most basic understanding we can have that defines both the kind of possibility for the assemblage of the world, the condition for the possibility of that experience, and also at the same time our own shift in perception and interaction with the environment. And it's quite crucial in Dewey's account the fact that that kind of life grows transitioning from one arrhythmic phase, from one disruption to the next, through the temporary resolution of these imbalances. And so growth, he says, is achieved when a more extensive balance between the organism and the environment is reached. And rhythm in this respect is both that kind of balancing mechanism that allows for the transformation and the temporary stabilization in the flux of change. Why am I returning to this? Because there is a clear, I think, affinity and potential in thinking of rhythmic enmeshment of living beings with their environment, together with, if not powered by, those arrhythmic transition and the experience of learning or lifelong learning. More than that, it's not just an affinity or a mirroring of the experience of learning, this transitioning from one disruption to the next, affecting growth and transformation. It's also at the level of the institution, the exposure of that intricate fabric of intersecting and clashing institutional domains. And when I speak of institutional domains, I refer to education as an institution, but family, market, state, to name a few, that constitute the woven fabric of the everyday in the university. More specifically, then, the question of growth and stabilization through crisis that I'm interested in is constitutive of the educational experience. So a rhythmic form, a rhuthmós here, is a relationally situated perception that allows us to see the student's experience both of cognitive and affective transformation as it's activated, for instance, during meaningful educational encounters, such as those triggered by collective reading of foundational text in doctoral studies. And, by no coincidence, I'm referring to this experiment with doctoral reading, because, maybe we will have time to discuss it later in the Q&A, but this is an experiment I'm currently conducting, and a project I am working on that combines phenomenological and rhythm analytical insights to explore the possibilities, the rhythmic possibilities of reading in doctoral education. To zoom in a bit closer on what was the original title of this presentation. So Rhuthmós as not just a form, but the ethico-pedagogical form of and for the university. So one of the consequences of exploring and examining this affinity between rhythm as form and education as Rhuthmós is the opening for a further exploration of the ethical and pedagogical possibility of Rhuthmós in higher education. And to get there, I mobilize and use Barth's understanding of ideorhythmy, which is a fantasy that he addresses in his series of notes for a lecture course and seminar at the Collège de France, where he addresses head-on the question of human coexistence. So the question I left lingering earlier on about continuity of life and continuity of learning. So he explores the fantasy of ideorhythmy, which is a form of living together in which each one recognizes and respects the individual rhythm of the other. And it does that with that kind of magnificent and idyllic image of the convent on Mount Athos, where these monks live in a community that is both secluded and isolated from the rest of society, but also in contact with one another, in such a way that each monk is free to conduct their own life according to their own rhythm. They only meet at regular intervals, I think, to share lunch and dining and for prayers, and then they are free to impose their own rhythm of existence upon themselves. And right after introducing this fantasy, he also introduces the kind of opposing image, the famous scene from the window that portrays a mother that pushes an empty stroller whilst holding her child by hand and dragging them along, irrespective of their pace. And Barth says she walks at her own pace, unaware of the fact that her son's rhythm is different, and she's his mother. power, the subtlety of power, is affected through dysrhythmy or heterorhythmy. So these, polarized image of ideorhythmy as the ideal community of communion and distance, but also the scene from the window, the mother that drags the child along, raises the kind of double-edged question that concerns, on one hand, the sustainability or unsustainability of an ideorhythmic as a specific ethical concern. And again, the kind of lingering questions of dwelling and coexistence and cohabitation comes back. To what extent do we want and can live with others, and with what degree of connection and separations? And this is a question that deals directly with the institutional, the physical form of the university as we know it, especially in the aftermath of the pandemic event. As we have seen, a clear transformation and in many ways collapsing of the form, of the physical form of the university, and reconfiguration in a virtual form, now a hybrid form. So I leave it there, just to explain and expose the kind of relevance of this question. Can we live with others? Do we want it? But also the kind of pedagogical turn of this question is, if we do want to live together, in what ways and how can we appropriate or create meaningful and inclusive spaces of coexistence? Clearly, the question of power that is affected through arrhythmia, and especially features quite highly in the dominant form of the capitalist university, is at the forefront of this reflection, but also of Barth's understanding of the kind of rebellious, unruly nature of ideorhythmy against rhythm in this respect. So he reminds us that each and any demand for ideorhythmy, for a fugitive rhythm, is always made in opposition to power. So as an illustrative point, I shift the focus once again from the university as a form that has perhaps reached the end of its possibility, to forms of education. And in particular, I focus on doctoral education, because I think it's a powerful example where we see this very strong clash of the rhythm as we know it, the rhythmicity, the pace, the kind of imposition of the linearity of a number of strong beats of the doctoral candidates that, out of metaphor, corresponds with punctuation of deadlines, doctoral milestones, the examination, but also and more coexisting pressures for doctoral students to publish, to win projects, to capture grants, and all the kind of pressures that contemporary, particular highly marketized universities are subjected to. So this serves as an illustrative point, but as a starting point to shift the focus from rhythm as form and forms of education within the institution, such as doctoral education. In this case, the demand of ideorhythmy, so what we see as the manifestation of a number of crises in the doctoral candidate that come at a point of intersections of opposing rhythms. For instance, rhythms of personal life, of family commitment. This is particularly strong and acute in case of part-time students, but is true for full-time students as well. Managing demands that come from different dimensions of existence, and the strong dominating demands of the linear rhythms of the doctoral journey, cast in institutional terms. The question becomes then that a demand for this kind of fugitive rhythm, or Rhuthmós, takes the forms of a resistance that is always occurring in the kind of penumbra of the everyday life, in critical moments of revelation or discovery, that can and that do occur quite unpredictably, very often in spaces that are co-created by doctoral candidates and within the supervisory relationship, in spite of institutional constraints. And here there are clear echoes with, for instance, Søren's contribution to the seminar series. He was introducing the notion of the university as a rift and bringing in the kind of dark ontology, notions of suspensions, vulnerability and exposures, and all that, I think, comes into place in looking at this ontological excess of the fugitivity of a rhythm that happens almost in a clandestine way within the university, but act as, I think, a healthy counterposition to what we see as probably the stifling rhythms of linear production, consumption, and accumulation. So what I want to draw attention to, and I'm, I think, moving towards the end of this presentation, is the fact that we have a duty and a responsibility, which is not simply to be reactive to the dominant form we are currently inhabiting and coexisting in, but we do have a responsibility or a responsibility to choose forms and produce spaces that kind of create alternative gravitational fields or centripetal forces that, in a sense, are capable of restoring a rhythmic balance necessary to live and grow through repetition and difference, commoning and variation, through crisis, but not through the exacerbation of crisis that we are currently witnessing. And just, mentioning in passing, but is very much the elephant in the room, the major epidemic in mental health and well-being that is very much endemic in higher education at this point. So I think Sunil Mangani captures this passage very, very neatly when he talks about a political, but also an ethical aesthetic that is at stake in this understanding of Rhuthmós, which questions, as I just said, our responsibility to form, more so than needing to declare a particular political position. So the emphasis here is on the relational production of forces from which we see the aesthetic production of ethics emerging. So, said otherwise, an exploration of the ethical possibility in education resonates very profoundly with rhythmic forms of education that are centered on relationality, difference as variation, anticipatory presence, and the practice of attention founded on commoning, care, and longing, as Tim Ingold would put it. So the lingering question is still there, which is how, to make those demands for ideorhythmy in opposition to institutional power, and to find ways in which, perhaps through temporal and aesthetic imagination, the fantasy of ideorhythmy, which is the coexistence of autonomous, self-directed rhythms, can be not just imagined, but cultivated as a form of interstitial resistance. In the case of doctoral supervision, I would argue in the supervisory practice and relationship. So if we extend, the notion of education and consider it as, in extending the idea of form, the perpetual formation and deformation of non-stable subject, as Bogeson claims, then we should fully embrace the responsibility of form giving as an anticipatory practice of temporal imagination in the everyday. A transformation which results, in Lefebvrean terms, from the encounter of mimesis, praxis, and poiesis, as it behooves the metaphilosophical thought to imagine and propose new forms, or rather a new style that can construct itself practically and realize the philosophical project by metamorphosizing the everyday. And I think I will stop here to open up space for discussion. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Fadia. Wow, I mean, that was dense, and I'm very happy that we had the privilege to listen to your presentation. I already have some questions because your whole terminology and approach, I think that it sort of touches upon the quite similar problems to what many times we try to grasp with, but it uses very specific terminology to get hold of that. So I would be very interesting of like trying to like look for a space in which those ideas can meet each other, and maybe in that sense also look for some specificity in how we approach them. But before I pose my own question, I would like to ask if there are some questions from the from other participants, as we have open floor and everybody can come up with a question. All right, there is a question from Franek. So Franek, please join us and pose your question or commentary.
Okay, hi, sorry, I don't have like the video today because of the some issues with the computer, but yeah, thank you very much for like very interesting presentation. And I was just like very interested about like this, I think some tension between like the trying to establish some maybe like collective rhythm and like individual rhythm of a scholar. And I understand like this distinction about like this power of arrhythmia and like some individual rhythm that it would be very good to cultivate, but like is in this like distinction also some space for creating some like more collective rhythm, like one rhythm for like many people, like in dance, like when they can like act collectively in the one rhythm? Or is it rather like, or are you rather like focusing on like cultivating just like individual rhythms?
Thank you for the question. I mean, this is a question that is a bit of a Matryoshka question, includes many other questions and observations. So there's no easy answer to this, because my focus isn't on the individual rhythms. It would be rather in collective social rhythms as forms of organizing, as forms of resistance. So in that, I am guilty of always going back to that kind of critical theory that is very much rooted in the Marxian work of Henri Lefebvre and his theorization of rhythm as a pedagogy of appropriation. But in what I tried to present today, there was precisely this attempt to to pose the question of ideorhythmy as is it possible to find ways to function individually, to respect our own individual rhythms, but at the same time being able to mobilize the force of the social, that is the means through which we perpetuate life and education. I pose it as a question precisely because I don't want to pose it as a fantasy, as Barthes did. I want to pose it as a question with the possibility of acting on it. I think we need both. We need both of a clearer and stronger awareness of individual rhythms, but also we also definitely need the rhythms of collective organizing, or rhythm as a social. I like your the image of the kind of choreography, the harmony in the organization of movement, the kind of organized movement in time that is the Platonic understanding. In that harmony, precisely in the Platonic understanding, there is also an ethics that is in this kind of harmony, but is a dangerous path, I think, because if we think of a choreography, I ask the question: who devised the choreography? Who decides who decides the relationship between movements and times and this kind of variation? So I always return to the political at the heart of this, the political and ethical aesthetic of it, if that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you so much for clarification.
Okay, but there is a question also from Andrew. Andrew, please go ahead.
Hi, Fadia. Thank you so much. And apologies for being late. I was running from another meeting to get to this one. So apologies if this question has been addressed already. But the reference to BART and Mount Athos, I thought was interesting because there's the question of separation implied there. So different rhythms. And then it got me thinking about Neil Stephenson's Anathem and, different orders operating on different rhythms. So I was just interested in, if rhythm is social, but we're talking about different kinds of rhythms, I'm not really fully sure how to formulate even my question is how much is separation implied in these different kinds of rhythms, and how much of it is a kind of withdrawal to allow an idiorhythm, because we're talking about the interstitials, which is kind of between spaces, and it's opportunistic almost. So I suppose that's my question is kind of what's the difference between kind of separation and opportunistic finding something within the gaps?
No, I think you touch a very important point, especially for theorization, because I think there is a separation in the abstraction of rhythm, and I think this is the difficult point in grasping how rhythm operates both at individual level and at a collective level, which is the fact that we experience it organically. We are not aware of any separation. We are immersed in that connection. And that is that is the organicity of the connection between the living organism and their environment. But when we think of it, we extract a form, an abstraction of the form at the edge of this experience. And that, I think, is in one sense promising, because that kind of rear view on what we have just experienced allows us to have the distance and the power for critique. So a diagnostic of this of the moment that we have experienced in rhythmic terms tell us what we want to change about it. So the short question is, we are not experiencing a separation as we live rhythmically. So it's not in the experience, but it's in the theorization and in the speaking or writing rhythms that we introduce the separation. And it is in this that I think is the potential to mobilize it as a form of critique, or a lens through which we can understand that which cannot be separated, which is life and education.
Andrew, would you like to add something? If not, there is another question from Martin.
No, Martin, go ahead.
Okay.
Thanks, Fadia. I think what you've done is sort of raise lots of questions rather than necessarily answering lots of questions. Only yes, I've got a sort of convoluted one, if I may, which is one about Dewey and two parts, one about Dewey, one about doctoral education. And I was interested in your use of Dewey, first of all, particularly his work, Harter's experience. I'm trying to recall what his main argument is. Maybe more than one, but what one I think is one of the problems with the everyday is it's not memorable, and what art can do is sort of create a sort of it's sort of artificial, but it's a bounded sort of something that has a beginning and an end. In other words, and temporal in that sense, in the sense that it's otherwise continuous experience that can make something art, and it stands out from the mundane because of that, and that's where the aesthetic aspect is concentrated more when that happens, something that stands out from the everyday. If the everyday is the mundane is typically rhythmic, then that sort of it's sort of against rhythm in that sense, if I interpreted Dewey correctly. And but also think that because art's and the creation of the aesthetics linked with creativity as well. And the other aspect you rightly focused on was the sort of institutional rhythms of universities as institutions, and imposing rhythms on social rhythms, also individual rhythms of those who are under its auspices. And in particular, the capitalist sort of factory model of the university, which when applied to doctoral education has turned in, and I'm thinking primarily of the sort of recent history in the UK, into this more regimented, time-bound, with strict stages to follow type of educational program, which and because it's more and more becoming more mass education and mass sort of factory output, can only, I think this is possibly one of the points you made, it can only be sort of stifling of creativity as a result. So the strictures and structures imposed upon doctoral education have that negative effect. At the same time, then it's not difficult to see why they've come about in terms of policy initiatives. Too many people registered for doctorates who just never finish, and isn't that a waste as the sort of challenge to the open-ended model? So it's a bit more thoughts than questions there. So one's about interpretation of Dewey, and one's about what's the ideal sort of form of doctoral education, I guess.
Yeah, and I appreciate the points, and I appreciate also that it's quite difficult to expand on this thinking in half an hour, and also very conscious that the rhythm thinking carries this difficult language with it. So in one way, if I understood correctly, interpretation of Dewey in this sense is, on one hand, instrumental to come and describe that kind of undersea mountain that is what we don't see of rhythm, that kind of vibrational, visceral, resonant condition for the possibility of an experience to happen. In fact, he starts from living being and the environment. In many ways, what I'm using it for is to say this translates a kind of mechanism, if you like, that explains how, if rhythm is this dynamic relation between living being and environment, and is both kind of responsible of the shift, the transformation, the growth, and the pains that go with that kind of growth, that for me is deeply resonant with any phase of painful transformation and growth that we encounter when we learn and when we live. So that connects that undersea mountain of the ontological aspect of rhythm, as I like to call it, the inner vibration of the earth that reverberates on the surface. What we see on the surface, the tip of the iceberg, and here I come to your second part of the question on doctoral education and the clash between the regimenting of the dominant rhythms that are the rhythms of capitalism, institutionalized in the university form, in highly marketized systems as we know it. And that we see it clashing fundamentally with a number of aspects of the lived experience, of the bounded rhythmic experience of our students. Not only when they have to, for instance, as I mentioned, part-time students deal with their careers, but also their families, their commitments, anything else that happens in any other domain of life. But first and foremost, the creative endeavor is arrhythmic, is painful, it proceeds through stop and goes, it's anything but linear, and it is anything and everything but proceeding through a linear milestones that yet are the demands imposed on the students. And I do see lots of the kind of existential crisis that, are very typical of this kind of liminal transitional phase that is the doctoral journey, happening at this painful intersection. So there is an irreducibility sometimes between what's demanded and what are the processes. So it's that I refer to as the ideorhythmy. So when you ask of me, what's the ideal form of the doctoral education? I think is one that forcefully expands the possibility for ideorhythmy to exist within that. What I'm asking for very pragmatically is a rebalancing of the doctoral form that takes on the kind of shape of the institution and shape of the capitalist production, consumption, distribution, and the kind of the unruliness of the creative endeavor, but also an expansion of the existential element, the dwelling, if not to say, you know, what Lefebvre used to call the architecture of enjoyment, that is very much lost in many of the experiences that we hear nowadays. So in many ways, what I said today has already been said by all of you in different forms with a different repertoire, but it's a different ways of connecting, I guess, with some of the strongest and most difficult challenges that the form of the university as we know it is now in this historical time facing. So I think there is also a call for a shift in this form. Whether it's a form for the university, I'm skeptical about it. I think we'll see a multiplicity of forms. I would like to see a proliferation of forms that surely, slowly but surely erodes the dominance of one that we know very well, because we are subject to it, molded by it. And that's why I say, and I call for a responsibility not to be reactive, but to inform. It's a conscious choice of different forms of education here that I'm requesting. I hope I at least partially addressed some of your points.
Oh, yes, thanks. Yeah, lots more to think about again, yes.
Okay, any other questions? If not, I have, there is a question from Ron. So Ron, please, if you could join us.
Thank you. A tremendous offering from you, Fadia, if I can say so. I'd love to see this all written down. Perhaps you've written it all up elsewhere and I should follow that up with you. I don't have a question. I just have thoughts that you've sparked and engendered in me, which I can only share with you in a very feeble way. I'm dazzled by the depth and rigor and subtlety of your presentation. My first thought is that being in higher education is a matter of living with multiple rhythms, and these rhythms slide across each other, and they are very often antagonistic in relation to each other. The pedagogical, the institutional, the educational, the disciplinary. I don't know that you mentioned disciplines, but they have their own rhythms. And all of this, there's also power attaching to these different rhythms, weaknesses of power, and so some rhythms are being expunged. And so we haven't the time for thinking, because thinking takes time, and thinking moves at a different pace. So concepts here are both of pace, the pace of a rhythm, and the intensity of a rhythm, and also the time horizon that attaches to rhythm. Is it a short term or is it a long term? So the complexities of rhythm multiply here. And then we have rhythms within rhythms. I mean, the poor old doctoral student, I mean, goodness knows what it's like these days to be a doctoral student, because you're not only living with multiple rhythms, there are, as I say, rhythms within rhythms. You take the different elements of the doctoral study these days, and it's an assemblage of different rhythms. Poor old students having to, what do I tend to now? And do I tend to the short term or the long term? It must be pretty well impossible these days. And then we have, of course, you didn't mention this, the role of the digital and how that imposes itself on rhythms and injects its own rhythms. and that itself is an assemblage of multiple rhythms. So sometimes you have to respond to the email immediately, and sometimes you have a little bit more space, and so on and so forth. The digital is a composite of different rhythms, I take it. So, as I say, I don't have a question for you. I just simply want to show you at any rate, Fadia, that you've helped me open up my mind to the complexity of rhythm in higher education and in universities. And I like to distinguish between universities as institutions and higher education as a set of educational ventures, and rhythms move on different planes, therefore, in relation to the university and to higher education. With all of this, I'm thinking about critical theory. I want to try and do some writing on critical theory, and it suggests to me here, particularly with some of the authors you've mentioned, that the very concept of rhythm, it offers as a resource for developing a kind of critical theory of higher education. And I hadn't thought of that before. Or at least if I had thought of it, you reminded me of some of my writing earlier, which I've forgotten about. I need to go back to that and see what I wrote. Because I think there is here the basis or the set of resources that you're offering us for a different kind of critical theory of higher education. Anyway, thank you very much. As you see, you've sparked off all sorts of scribbles, and I've done a lot of scribbles which I'm going to keep and build on. So thank you very much.
Thank you for all these comments, and as usual, the generosity, and you sparked back lots of dimensions and planes that clearly I didn't have time to elaborate on in these presentations, but are part of a larger plan that I have. Also, this is based on a chapter that is in press, so as soon as it's out, I will be able to share it with you if you like it. So there it's much more elaborated, but I hope I kind of brought in the key elements and tenets. And yes, there is in my head as well, there has always been the idea of producing a critical theory for a critical humanism based on a rhythmic understanding of higher education. There is also the question that I left lingering there as for, when we talk about rhythm, we talk about the sensory, we talk about embodiment, we talk about the lived experience very much, but we are still very much conditioned by the logos, the eyes of the university. I'm always returning to the eyes and Calvino's written and unwritten world, when he talks about homo legens. So that haunting questions about what do we see from the university and with a view of what? We could easily expand to the other sensory repertoire of the university. What do we hear? What do we project? What do we touch? What do we smell? What do we sense? So there are many different dimensions to this, and you rightfully pointed to the digital that injects a whole other layer of multiple clashing rhythmic encounters and expressions that we have to face every day. But thank you for all these comments, and yeah, I hope I gave my thoughts with a little bit of clarity or clear enough in respect of this complexity.
I don't see any hands raised, but Fadia, I wanted to ask you, because just building on things that were already said, I was wondering, because when we are thinking about a potential starting point for a critical theory here, and also a form of critique of capitalism within higher education, I'm thinking about a possible problem we are facing, and I'm quite interested in how we can approach this problem from your perspective, because once we think about capitalism and its presence in the sector, it not only imposes a linear rhythm, but it's also a force of synchronicity, right? So it synchronizes different strata of the systems, and those stratas can have their own rhythms, but then again, the capital is what starts to mediate them. Like, for example, like once we take, I don't know, let's say center and peripheries, right? So of global knowledge production. I can imagine that center has a very different rhythm than peripheries. And then again, capital is not only then imposes those individual rhythms, but it's something that try to synchronize them. And I was wondering how we can try to approach this problem of capital as something that synchronizes different rhythms within the sector. How we can like try to approach these problems from your perspective, from your lens.
Well, from the lens, certainly from the lens of the fugitive stoppage in the flow that is Rhuthmós, there we have the possibility to subvert and to use deliberately a counter rhythm that disrupts the kind of synchronicity that is imposed. But more than that, I think, you know, if we go back to rhythm, that is the kind of Platonic understanding of rhythm that is based on the kind of numerical force, if you like, that goes in line with this synchronicity and synchronization that you use. We also have to oppose to this another understanding of rhythm, and an understanding of rhythm that can help us disrupt, in a sense, the kind of Hegelian dialectic system of affirmation, negation, negation of negation. That kind of mode of proceeding is disrupted in the more, I think, I don't want to say, well, there isn't, all I'm trying to say here, and it's not elaborated at all, but the disruption goes through the unruliness of something that cannot be predicted. You cannot enter Rhuthmós knowing that there will be a staged development that will end in a certain way. And that is the kind of, it's the opposite of an algorithm. You cannot anticipate that. And that's why it is currently suppressed. And that's why my interest is in there. Because what I see in rhythm, as in dominant rhythm, is the force of abstraction. Force of the kind of concrete abstraction that Marx speaks about is the force of extraction and alienation and social domination. And, you know, it's paramount, and we see it in universities in many ways. We feel it on our skin. What you don't want, what you don't see, is the open-ended, unpredictable process that is set in motion by the encounter of the individual or the social with changing environments. So Rhuthmós is deliberately resisting. So it's deliberately not something that, not a force that can be organized or that follows a meter. It, if you like, represents that kind of visceral, carnal correspondence of being. It's a life-affirming force, whereas that capitalistic synchronicity and the control that goes within the synchronization brings death, brings the kind of, it springs to mind, you know, theory of resonance there. And Rhuthmós has a lot to do with Rosa's understanding of resonance. So in resonance, you are opening up to the uncontrollability of the world. And the minute you use that synchronicity and synchronization and bring things under control, you are killing them. So you look for a life-affirming force here, but one that isn't there to be tamed. Whether this is used as a concept, as a way to, as a critique, as a way to mobilize a counter, or simply a resistance to what we see, I think is a good antidote. But much needs to be done to really, I think, conceptualize that as a proper tool. For now, it's a possibility.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I recognize this potentiality. Absolutely, I think it's quite fascinating. I think that much of the debate is like we face a sort of a dichotomy, right? That on the one side there is acceleration, the process of academia is something ever accelerating, and the dominant form of critique is simply saying, okay, we have to slow down, right? So there is. Yeah, and I think that you coming with the idea of sort of pluriversarity of those forms of is like, you know, you are going, you know, like crossing diagonally this dichotomy, and I very much appreciate this effort.
Definitely against this dichotomy, which remains at the summit of the undersea mountain that I was talking about. It remains the first and only thing we perceive, and it's a false dichotomy. It doesn't go deep enough to see what's underneath, and only by going underneath you can change the big levers that explain that you know might generate something different. So it's not about saying that acceleration is bad and slowing down is good. Not at all. It's a very simplistic and, you know, kind of superficial way of addressing the issues of social acceleration, especially when we talk about higher education and learning. Certainly not good for discussions around learning. It's definitely not about, it's much deeper than how fast can we produce and ride on the kind of thrill of speed. It's not just that.
Absolutely, yeah, and this is very much appreciated, at least from my side. Okay, do we have any other voices? Any final remarks from? Okay, I think that I'm not sure whether we said everything that is to be said about it, but I very much hope that there will be many other opportunities to sort of carry this conversation forward, bring us you know, closer and develop those ideas. I think many of us will see each other in Trondheim very soon, so there for sure will be other possibilities also to discuss these ideas in person. And for now, I would like to wholeheartedly thank you for your presentation. It was, as Ron said, it was very subtle and really inspiring in that sense that it at least pushed my understanding of those problems. So I'm very grateful for you, to you. Yeah, and I would like to thank others for joining us, contributing to the discussion. So thank you very much. I wish you a very pleasant afternoon, and hope to see you in the upcoming events and occasions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity and for the questions and comments. Thank you very much. Really appreciated that.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.